That was a funny thing to start on. Uh, just gonna test the sound here.
Hmm.
Uh, just to anybody watching, last time we had no sound, so I'm just double checking that it's working.
Which made
It,
for a very interesting vlog, or whatever you want to call it.
you just watch us talk and not say anything. The
And if
sound
you're a
is
lip
working.
reader, I'm sure it was very interesting, but otherwise, probably not so much.
I think it's probably harder to read my lips because I don't talk the same way as most people with the lack of teeth. But hello, everybody. Welcome to Digression from the Theme. We said on the last one, which nobody will be aware of because it had to be removed for having no sound, that we were going to discuss transracialism today. And I know that's a touchy
Transracialism?
subject.
Yeah, transracialism. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a touchy subject. I'm not really worried about getting in hot water because I want to talk about it from a relatively logical standpoint, not personal, because I don't really have a horse in this race. It does not affect me, and neither does the issue of transgenderism, not on a personal level at any rate. And when I call it an issue, I just mean the conversation. I don't mean that it is a problem inherently. That is not my intention, so don't misclip me there.
Hmm.
But just to start off, when we've talked about it, now I've seen a lot of people talking about this in a very different way, right? Because you see people talk about transgenderism, and there's a lot of defense about it. Not just people being defensive, but people coming to the defense of the idea of transgenderism, which is fine for me, for adults. If you are capable of making those choices both legally and morally and personally, like, just if it's your life, you can do what you want. That's up to you. Uh, Transgenderism specifically runs into a moral issue with me when it comes to people converting their kids, but that's not where we're going to start today. That's just a little note there. But it's funny that people who tend to be very inclusive, at least in their own,
Hmm.
declarations, are so outraged by the idea of transracialism,
Hmm.
which is, to me, on a biological level, and ooh, biology, it is significantly less of a leap than transgenderism. There's a very clear delineation in your biological gender or sex, whichever one is the word they want people to use. I'm just gonna say gender, but there is a clear line there. Your DNA has determined it. The same thing as race, but race is pretty clearly a spectrum. It's you do any DNA test and you're dealing with multiple percentages that go down to these
Yeah.
tiny increments, and you could be anywhere on that scale. Funny enough,
Yeah.
I saw a TikTok earlier today where somebody brought up a color chart and said, "I hate the idea of people calling other people black and white because everybody's brown. Everybody's on a shade of brown.
Right. Right.
Nobody's actually in grayscale. Even albinos are sort of very, very, very faint reddish brown.
Almost
Uh,
pinkish.
yeah,
Almost
and
pinkish. Yeah.
they're the very sort of rare exception to the brown rule by being sort of pink. And people have defended that race is more of a spectrum, and it's very odd how insulted a lot of people are for other people. A lot of this isn't personal insult. It's ideological insult. It's like, I believe this and you disagreeing with it is an attack on my worldview rather than it being a personal gripe. I don't raise these points to people who have made the decision themselves because that's I don't feel that, like, I have the right to an opinion, but what am I going to gain out of talking to somebody who has made this choice that I wouldn't make for me? I won't say I disagree with the choice because I don't. They have the freedom to make the choice. Personally, I wouldn't do it. And I think that's where a lot of it sort of comes into a problem area is when you say you disagree with something, a lot of it is personal, and you kind of are saying that you personally wouldn't do it. And then you can dig more into ideology with that, but it seems like in these conversations there's no gradient. You are always in ideology when you make a disagreement, and that ends up putting you in a sticky situation where you can't have these conversations a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's curious when you just break this down for a second. Just go to the fundamentals. Um, Transgenderism, because I think we're contrasting these because there are these differences, as you say, between how they're treated and how they're perceived, etc. So, um, many people say, of course, that maleness and femaleness is immutable, but we know, I think factually, that there are people out there that I'm not going to get into the science behind it, but that for one reason or another, have this feeling within themselves that they're in the wrong body, right? And so
Right.
they either learn to live with that, or they grow out of it, or they don't. And if they and it can be I can see how it could be a real, and we know it's life threatening for some people. Um, they want to escape that by transmuting themselves into a body type that um, conforms with what they believe inside and what they feel inside. I want to use the word believe because it's not just belief, but for people who go through this, by and large, they're not doing it just as a cosmetic procedure. They're doing it because they truly believe. So we give those people the benefit of the doubt. Um, and yet people, I think, where I sort of come down on this is the people who would accept that, who would say that that's right, that is the reality for them, and they should pursue their own reality. But when it comes to race, it's less acceptable, right? I mean, isn't that your
Oh yeah,
sense?
absolutely. Most people
It's
won't
much
even
less.
they won't even discuss it. I have a number of people that I know personally who, if you say transracialism, conversation's dead. They don't want to talk about it. They'll talk about
So
transgenderism all day, but you
yeah,
throw race in it.
and you and I both know people who are transgender,
Yep.
and friends. So it's not just acquaintances, people you've known for a long time, for example, in your case.
Yeah.
Um, and yet we have the best example I can think of this is, it's not a great example, but I'm going to use it because I think it breaks this open a little bit. Obama was mixed race, but
Right.
he's on the spectrum, right? I mean, if you
The
looked
racial
at him,
spectrum.
race,
Of
yeah, right. That's what I mean. Yeah,
I
I'm
just
not
mean
beast.
because, of course, out of context that could sound.
No, I
But
know. I appreciate that. That's helpful. So, I'm presuming people don't just listen to 5 seconds at a time, but that
you
can
would
happen.
think.
But if you want to carve it out, you could, and make me look really bad, or you. So Obama is on the spectrum of racial identity. On the other hand, he identified as African American,
Right.
right? Now, I really don't want to get into the birther stuff. One might argue that he's not even American. No, he's not. I'm just kidding there. But his mother was from Kansas, and his father was African. Well,
Yep.
not African American, but from Africa
Right.
directly. And he, because I think his skin color and his general look, it was easier for him, I can't tell his story for him, obviously, but it was easier for
Well,
him to identify as African American.
oh, it
Although
certainly
that,
was.
and he would probably say, and I think Michelle would definitely say, that was a disadvantage to him, right, culturally, and maybe so. Although for him personally, it doesn't seem to have been, because he ended up on a fast track to the presidency for a variety of reasons. But the point is, for him, he could have gone either way. But most people would look at him and say, "No, if you had to vote, most people would say he's African American because he looks like it, right?
Yeah.
And I could be Biden-esque and talk about how he speaks, but that would be horrible because that was just a horror show. Um, so now let's take the case of a person that was a woman in working in Seattle, I think, in a NAACP office. She was the director of the local chapter, and I've got her name up here somewhere. It doesn't really matter. Her name's not really important. Well, she was in Spokane. That's where she was,
Yeah.
and
It's
she
okay.
she identified as an African American woman. And I got a picture up here that I'm looking at, and her skin is fairly light. It looks like she may have darkened it a little bit, and she's got her hair permed, um, and she passed for African American, because we all know people that are very light skinned, right?
Right.
That's to your earlier point, is that most African Americans in the United States have at least some Caucasian blood in genetics in their
And it
body. It's
moves
just
them closer to the middle of that racial spectrum where you could claim either one.
right, right. No, that's exactly right. But those are the people that I'm not so interested in them. I'm interested in the ones that are clearly one or the other, or we're not talking about Asians, but shoot, why not? If we're going to talk about race, let's open it up because it's not black versus white, although I think it gets framed that way. Let's say you decide because you don't look anything at all like you're Asian, not at all, right? You and I are both heavily like 99% European, right? Northern
Although, when I was a teenager, if I pulled my glasses off, I have more almond shaped eyes than some other Caucasian
Okay,
people that I
fair,
know. If I really
fair.
worked at it, I might have been able to pull off a
Yeah,
half
so
look.
it's different if you're a mixed race person. And
Yeah,
I hope and pray that people understand that I'm using that as a it just as a defining term, and I don't and no way do I mean it pejoratively at all.
right.
It just right.
Yeah,
If you're a mixed race person, because African genes are dominant generally over Caucasian, at least skin color wise. If you have a parent of each, you're more likely to have darker skin, right?
right.
It's just the way it is, right? Because the mean that we're all going toward over some long period of time is to have darker skin, right? Where most of the world is white's light skin is an anomaly,
Yeah,
right? Because it really reflects a period of time when Northern Europeans got no sun, and all about the production of vitamin D in the wintertime. So if
yeah,
you're in the Scandinavian countries or in Northern Europe, or you're in Alaska, you're going to have light skin over time because it's adaptive. It has to be.
yeah,
But that's a minority of the world population now. There's so much more and south of the equator, that population is growing much more quickly. So the whole point is the color of the planet is darkening, and if you took a weighted average racial coloring, it's not white for sure. But so if you take a person, let's say you take an Asian person who wants to be Caucasian. Okay, there's one. Well, that does happen. It turns out in some
yeah.
in a minor way in Japan and in China. I think Japan more so. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
I
Is that
think
there
you're
are
right about
people
that.
who will get their eyes fixed to make them look more Western. Well, when they say Western, they mean European. When they say European, they mean Caucasian, right?
Well,
Now
there
they
and
don't.
also culturally, and I believe this is also Japan. They have a history of in theater painting their faces white and trying to look as porcelain as possible
Yeah,
because
yeah,
and I don't know if it is related at all to being to having seen Caucasians or if it's just related to this sort of vague image of purity that occurs over all cultures. This is not
yeah.
localized to
Right,
Caucasian cultures or
right.
anything. It is that when things are, and this could be very dangerous territory because it's hard to describe whiteness as purity racially because that's not right.
Oh,
But
better not do that.
color
Yeah.
wise,
Well,
white
literal
is the
color. Yeah.
absence of color. It is the absence of things, which in some degree you could call flaw. Not with skin, obviously, but you have a white sheet, it's clean, generally speaking, historically.
Hmm.
And if you had a brown sheet, well, it's probably made of something else, but it would more easily come off as dirty. Now, this does not apply to skin, but it has
Right.
been applied to skin culturally.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I don't know the answer to your question about cultures where light skin is preferred to darker skin, where women particularly, I think, cosmetically will shield themselves from the sun so as to keep their skin. I knew a person who actually was from Eastern Europe, who for her wedding didn't go out in the sun for a year, and I'm not
Oh, wow.
exaggerating. Covered her, well, had a big hat on and spent no time in the sun for an entire year because she wanted really, really white porcelain-esque skin when she got married. So I think that may for her maybe a cultural probably was just a personal preference.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't attribute wanting white skin in an Asian country to wanting to emulate Caucasians, but rather there was something else. There was some aesthetic that was related to that, and it,
Yeah.
it was cultural. Just like I had, as a quick aside, I we had an employee some years ago who was from Korea, and he looked at my earlobes, right? And he told me that in his country, though, my earlobes would be very attractive. I had never thought about my earlobes that way, but
Right.
it's a cultural beauty norm that we're talking about in this case. But the real question I think comes back to, given any two races and any one person that wants to go from A to B, um, is that any different than transgenderism? And why is it less acceptable than transgenderism?
And
That to me is the conundrum.
yeah, and to piggyback on that, so one, I know of a person I've seen, like, I don't know them personally, but I have seen videos on them online, which is a man who, I believe he's gay, but not that that matters, but that wanted to essentially uh, transform into a Korean pop star specifically. Not just a Korean person, but this image, right? If you look at a Korean pop star, a male one, they have so much makeup, they have very pure features, there's no pox on their face. They are very feminine,
Mm.
generally speaking. Some of
By
them
our
I
standard, I mean
some
by our
yeah, by our
standards, yeah,
standards.
yeah,
Um I would say they lean more towards the middle. Androgynous is probably the word because some of them I personally have not been able to easily identify the gender visually. It's only that I
yeah.
know that this is a boy band. Um, but he wanted to become a Korean pop star, not just a Korean person. Now, this is an interesting difference because you are trying to become a specific thing, like the woman who wanted to become a Barbie doll.
Oh,
But
sure, yeah.
because it is specifically a Korean pop star, this falls into the field of transracialism, and this person was lambasted for it. They had innumerable surgeries, and
Mm.
I think they were an okay looking guy before, but they ended up looking very strange. Their features were nowhere on the spectrum of Caucasian to Korean by the end of it, and they looked uncanny valley, sort of like a doll, because parts of their face were now fake. And
Yeah.
so, somewhere in there is a combination of racial and cultural transference. But the thing is that people will call out a lot of things as cultural appropriation, right? If I wear a sombrero and a what's it called, the a poncho, and
Hmm.
I walk around. Funnily enough, people have done this, like on TikTok, where a white guy did this. He even taped a mustache on. He went and
Yeah.
asked a whole bunch of different raced people at a college
Yeah.
campus, millennials probably,
Yeah.
uh, if this was offensive. And most of them asked, well, are you Mexican? One, okay, more people than just Mexicans wear sombreros. You're being racist by asking that question by your own standards. I'm just
Mhm.
saying. But
Yeah.
when he said no, they said, then yes, it is offensive. He then went to a Mexican town and asked a whole bunch of actual Mexicans, and they all said he looked great. They didn't care. And somewhere along the line, you gotta realize that if the actual culture isn't being offended by this, why the hell are you? This shouldn't be vicariously offensive to everybody. I get it that your ideology is stretching out to the community at large, but it's not your axe to grind if that race doesn't want it sharpened. If this is not a problem for them, why are you aiming to fix it? And I have a problem with
Mhm.
that because being human, the reason we are not like every other animal is because of a shared lived experience. Humanity does not function on a single lived experience. If we did, we would be every other animal. If our lifetime was the only thing that we considered our personal experience, we would not gain anything from anyone else. Meaning that from one generation to the next, the race as a whole would not move forward. It is the fact that we can study, appreciate, and convert cultures together and melt them together that makes us what we are. So, when you take things like cultural appropriation and you put this blanket over all cultural movement from one people to another, and you define culture by skin color and race rather than by where you live or your experience of a culture and your love of a culture, now you have a problem. Because now, not only are you actually being more racist by saying you were born as this, you're the only one who can be this, so be this. You're saying what people can't be. And that seems to be the biggest problem. It's like they, in the doublethink here, it's like, oh no, you can claim to be whatever you want, but you can't claim to be anything that you're not, except for when it comes to gender.
Right. Yeah, that's what I just don't get. So because if you're going to allow it someplace, you got to allow it everywhere,
Yeah,
right?
it's
Just like trans ageism, right? Why can't I claim to be 34 years old instead of my current age? Why? Well, that's the biological reality. Yes, that's true, but so is everything else. So it
yeah.
just
Well,
that's the thing that just boggles my mind is this lack of consistency. I'm like I think we started out by saying, listen, we're I think generally and otherwise supportive of people's they don't need to we don't need our they don't need our opinion, but we generally both agree that people can do whatever, right? We have the freedom to live our lives how generally speaking the way we want. And if somebody wants to if somebody born a male, just to use my language, and prefers to live as a female and do all the things physically to get them closer to that ideal, then that's up to them. I don't, I have no beef with that at
yeah.
all. None. None at all.
Well,
But
and
for this discussion, the question is, why is it different for race or other things? That's the question,
yeah, and a part
right?
of the thing that yeah, and a part of the thing that really gets to me, right, is as a writer, I I make a lot of comparisons between the dictionary and the lexicon.
Yeah, right, right, right.
I find the lexicon culturally useful, but logically idiotic. The dictionary is a reference point. You can look back at it and determine what should be meant, not
Right,
necessarily
right.
what is meant, but what should be meant by a given statement. And all of these arguments about all the new words and titles and labels that people want to use, it's like, okay, you can use that. But for reference, there has to be objective truth of some sort. We have to have something to look back at in order to balance the information. There are too many things in the world not to have an anchor. And so, if we don't have words that have true blue meanings that we can look back at and say, okay, well, this is what it's supposed to mean, what do you mean? If we don't have objective meanings, then we no longer have a source of information to base
Right,
our ideologies on, which is
right.
causing all these fractured ideologies which don't hold up. There's very
Right.
little, like, like you said, consistency across the board. And ideologically, you should have some consistency.
Right.
Some, so that people can at least try to talk to and understand you. Because if you believe one thing and are completely adamant about it, but it falls apart when you take it 1 inch to the left or 1 inch to the right, well, can I get to why you really believe this? I get that there is a desire to be known as what you want to be known as, and that is fine. But the hatred for any kind of objectivism, I don't think makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah, as you're talking, I keep thinking about what I think is the fundamental question here, and I think it's ultimately a political question. The politics of race are different than the politics of sexual identity, of gender identity. They're different,
Yeah.
right? Um, and the incentives are different. And frankly, there are odd incentives. I say odd because they involve the amount of money to be spent. I don't say this to be crass. It is an incentive. The amount of money to be made by advocating a transgender philosophy that's more broadly applied is huge for the hospital systems.
Oh, yeah.
I just, Vanderbilt got caught red-handed in a video of one of their administrators in 2000 or 2001, whenever it was. It's on YouTube or whatever, basically saying that a good new source of revenue treating the transgender children and young adults because of the repeat business and the drugs and every 3 months you're meeting with them and the surgeries and
Oh, and
there
these
are
things
tens or
are
hundreds of thousands.
they are unbelievably expensive,
Yeah, right.
especially because a part of and they don't ding the insurance companies don't hate them because they tend not to ding the insurance companies because in their view these are cosmetic a lot of the time. Now you can be dealing with actual, and people don't delineate these enough, actual
Right.
gender dysmorphia,
Right.
where when you look in the mirror like anorexia, you actually see something else. It is
Right.
actually a problem with your
Yeah.
cognition of your own gender.
Sure.
And then
Sure.
gender dysphoria, where you are just, let's say, displeased. You want to be and believe you should be in a different body. And then
Yeah.
just sort of general transitioning, where maybe you just want to sort of act more feminine. And that's fine, but you don't want to go through the whole rigmarole. But that middle ground where you believe you should be in another body, I don't know that insurance is going to, cover much of that. And so
I
the
don't know.
insurance companies don't hate it, and you're paying out the ass
It de-
for it.
well, and it may depend. There may be a state by state thing. It wouldn't surprise me at all if there are states like California, and I don't know this, but it wouldn't surprise me to see that there are states or medical systems, or even I don't know if Medicare does this either. I just don't know, but there's enough of this sense in government that it wouldn't surprise me if it's not done now. I mean, there are some prison systems, I believe, where prison system the state will pay for reassignment surgery. I'm pretty, you got to check
Really?
me on that, but I'm pretty sure of that. Yeah. Um, so, so yeah, I mean, so there's an economic incentive that's different for uh, transgender issues than for trans race issues,
They
because
could go
nobody
there too, though,
they
because they
could,
do have stuff like there's melanin injections, but they're not
sure.
popular, right? They're horrible to go through.
Well,
And
there's
because, right, the stigma right now means that
yeah.
if you darken your skin intentionally through very clearly stated cosmetic surgery, people are going to hate you for it. Probably more than people are going to not care, even.
Yeah, there was a period of time when being well tanned was considered an attribute of beauty, and
Right.
for people like bodybuilders, for example, it still is. But by and large, with this push against getting too much sun because of skin cancer, it's a less valuable. It's considered, I think, a less of a beauty trait. There are some Hollywood people that were always tan, um, and it became their trademark, but uh, but
Was his
that's
name
not the same
George
thing.
Hamilton?
George Hamilton, who I'm thinking of, yeah, yeah, he
But
always had a
there,
tan.
because it's only the physical outward aspect and there isn't a cultural aspect that people would deem as appropriation, they won't consider it transracialism. The same thing essentially
No,
with
right.
George Hamilton. There's a guy, I don't remember what he calls himself. He might call himself Zeus, honestly. I think that might be what he calls himself.
Yeah.
He's gone through many, many, many surgeries and different operations to have his skin darkened. And he does identify as African American
Yeah.
because he was, I'm pretty sure he was raised in an essentially all black community, and most of the people he knows are black. And the people he knows, don't hate him for it. They're like, oh no, yeah, he's one of us. But
Yeah.
everybody else, they look at it and they're like, no, 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 you can't do
Yeah,
that.
everybody else is offended by that. Well, so if you're going to give me a pass, if I choose to live as and try to become more female, and I'm going to live as a woman, and that's okay, and then why is anything else like this not okay? There are now women saying that trans women are appropriating their womanhood. I
Right.
mean, there's
And
now
it's
you see this backlash from women who feel like they're and
struggles as women.
I have no dog in this fight, right?
Right.
But this is what I'm hearing. That's why I'm not arguing it one way or the other. It's just there are women who are making this argument that this in fact is appropriation of a different kind. And why, if cultural appropriation is not appropriate, then why would this or anything else? So it's a very weird and mixed. I mean, I think it's a good. You raise a really good topic because it's complicated, because it doesn't make sense. It's
Yeah.
not logically
It's
consistent one thing to another.
and none of this is about us agreeing or disagreeing with the
No,
concepts of transgenderism or
no,
transracialism. It's
no, not at
just
all.
about the double standard,
Yeah.
which they are everywhere now. Double standards are the norm.
Oh yeah, that is the standard.
Yeah, they are.
They've
The
become the
standards
standard.
continually
Yeah,
double. It's
yeah.
and that connects to things like just like toxic masculinity versus being a gentleman, which are they're conflated, right? If you insist on paying for dinner, are you being an ass of a man, or are you being a gentleman? Well, you ask different people, you're gonna get a different answer. And it's like I
I
just
had
wanted
lunch.
to be nice.
Yeah, I had lunch with somebody today. It wasn't a date, but they offered to pay for lunch, and I said fine. I didn't, and I think it's in many respects the same thing. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that, and I've seen interviews recently exploring this. What do women expect from men and men from women? And you see these interviews. Usually, it's with young women and young men, in their 20s and 30s, I think, because they're more relevant for what's going on in the culture right now. I think
Right.
that where they ask questions like, I heard this yesterday, and I don't know who it is, but there's an African American gentleman who's maybe in his 50s or 60s, probably his 50s, and he asks young women how much they want their husband to make. Let's say it's husband wife. And this one interview I saw, I think it was yesterday or today, she said, "Well, he needs to make at least $400,000." And then then he runs the numbers. He says, how many men do you think what percentage of men make over $400,000? She goes, I don't know, maybe 3-4%, something like that. He goes, it's less than 1%. And then he said, and you understand that men's peak earning ages are from 45 to 55. Would you be okay with, marrying a 45 to 55-year-old man to get that kind of income? And she said, oh no. She said, and so his retort was, so you're just another delusional black woman. but I, but
Oof.
this is, yeah, oh yeah, it was funny. It was a funny interview, but it does speak, I think, to how disconnected things are from reality, and this discussion we're having about changing one's let's call it ethnic identity. I choose not to be German, Italian, and French and whatever. I want to be Romanian. Starting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I'm going to identify as Romanian.
There
Why
is
is
a
that not?
very interesting part of this. What if you are transitioning from one culture but
Yeah,
not visual identity?
Oh
So
yeah,
what
yeah.
if
Well, let's
you
keep.
only take the culture and you move from, let's say, you're Mexican and you claim to be from Spain or Puerto Rico?
Ooh. Oh, I'm sure there are Spaniards that would be offended by that. Not to broad brush,
Well,
but you know,
if somebody's from Puerto Rico and you call them Mexican, some of them will be offended.
oh yeah, do the same thing with Cubans.
Yeah.
You know, I'll tell you that you probably know the story, but that exchange student we had when you were very young,
Oh
um,
yeah.
uh,
Yeah,
from
Melissa.
Peru, but yeah, I just didn't want to use a name.
Well,
But
it's we're not using a last name.
no, no, we won't use the last name. But she was from Peru, so we'll narrow it a little bit. And she once went through this pecking order of Spanish speakers that they operate well she operates with, and I presume it as a 15-year-old or 16-year-old at the time that she's reflecting sort of the general norm. Well, the norm was that when you compared the quality of Spanish, let's call it Spanish as spoken in High Spanish in Spain, that Cubans spoke very well and Mexicans spoke very poorly, and Peruvians were not quite as good as Cubans, but much better than Mexicans. And it was very clear from her perspective that in their pecking order of Hispanic people, that and this is just her, that's not a sample, that the pecking order would put Mexicans pretty low and put Peruvians much higher. The funny thing was, judging by her skin color and the shape of her face, she probably had a large percentage of indigenous Peruvian person in her, and not a lot of European. That was just judging by her, again,
Yeah.
her skin color, which was relatively dark, not dark, but it was darker than a Spaniard's would be, I think. So
She was a
so it's
lightly
it.
milked coffee.
Yeah, it's a crema. You know, it's like
Yeah, the
well,
crema.
I think I think that's what they call Cubans, crema, but because although again, Hispanics come just like everybody else. They come in all sorts of colors.
Big
You know,
spectrum.
the spectrum is right. So, but I mean, this point I think is well taken. What if I choose to be a Romanian because I like Romania? I'm going to go join, Andrew Tate in jail over there because he and his brother got arrested for
Well, they
human
got let out
trafficking.
again. They got let out.
Yeah, they were like, I was
It was a
political.
24-hour hold.
Yeah, it was a political thing. I think they were just wanted to rough him up a little bit. But I thought of him when I was talking about this whole issue of you brought up, this toxic maleness or
Oh,
masculinity.
oh
But
yeah. He's the
but
king of it.
so well, yeah, yeah. So anyway, so I decide I want to be Romanian, and I do an accent that's reasonable. I don't speak a stitch of it, right? Romanian is very different than most of the other. I think Romanian is one of the other Romance languages, I believe. It's closer to Latin than many of the other European languages, certainly than French would be. But anyway, so what can I do that? I want to change tribes because I think this is tribalism.
People are gonna ding you for cultural appropriation, and it
Well,
circles back to my problem earlier with if you can't cross cultural boundaries at all, then as a species we are doomed. Society is doomed if we
no,
cannot at least lighten these borders between cultures. I don't
well,
think
we're just
any of it actually relates to biology at all.
a lot of this. Well, I think it's the biology of tribalism. I think humans are
Oh
in
yeah,
effect by nature tribal, and
and
when we
we
say
formed countless smaller tribes, men and women tribes. Everybody belongs to 8 different tribes, but you
yeah,
got to stay in your field. If you are a man, if this is like calling someone a straight cis man, you have named his tribes,
yeah, right.
and
But
you
it's
must
funny.
stay in them.
Yeah, it's not really it's not a tribe per se because usually tribes you need males and females to be a real tribe. But you're right. For
Socially, we
identification,
treat them that way.
we are we have become taxonomists to the extreme.
Yeah.
We're doing this taxonomy of the entire human persons by identifying everybody. And if you take it ad infinitum, every single person, there are 8 billion different categories. So the categories don't matter. There's no such thing as a category when you break it up too finely.
Yeah, if there's
right?
any amount of true uniquity, then you lose the ability to categorize. So when you take these things to the nth degree, you can no longer categorize, because if people are truly unique in any sense of the word, then they cannot be truly defined. And this is
So,
why we have broad objective words, so that we can subcategorize and understand. Because if
yeah.
I had to describe everything about myself completely specifically, I'd be doing it for the rest of my natural life.
Oh
If
yeah,
I,
yeah. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. But and I don't, there's really no but. We went from uh, an ideology in the '60s, which I subscribe to 100%, and it relates to something that was articulated by Martin Luther King when he said, "It's not the color, for my children, it's not. I look forward to a time when it's not the color of their skin, but the content of their character."
yep.
And I said that was the philosophy that led to the late '60s, and flower children and people going off and doing their own thing and mind expansion and all this other stuff, where individualism, right? So you can't define me because I am myself.
And we've
To
swung so hard in the opposite direction.
flung the other way is I need to articulate before I can introduce my name to you. I have to tell you, what my pronouns are, what my categories are, and you see this all the time on social media. People who introduce themselves as, I'm this, that, and this, and I'm, smiley schizophrenic, and they've got to define. They've got this Venn diagram which got 30 circles on it, and they're right smack dab in the middle, and I don't need to know any of that stuff.
Right. Well, I've got a couple points to make here that are all interlinked, right?
Go. Yeah.
One, I would say that the way we define people now is like a very bad novel, where you're not actually learning anything, but you just spent 18 pages reading about this character's face and their background that has no effect on the current situation or the plot at all. And that is how every interaction seems to be introduced, is with a character dump that will not affect the present situation. And secondly, a lot of this is also, so I don't like the term virtue signaling, but it's the closest
Yeah.
comparison, right? Which
Right.
is that rather than having actual moral virtue or actual social utility, you claim a tag that implies some kind of moral virtue or utility, like claiming you are a climate activist. No, you're not. 90% of what you do is probably actively affecting climate change. The small little token changes that you make or claim to make that you probably don't actually make are making relatively little difference in the long run. In addition to that, people claim mental conditions as a means of identifying character traits. That is not how it works. Your character is not and should not be defined by any amount of difference in the way your mind works, because if you have figured out or not figured out how to adapt to any condition you might have, that's where your character comes from, not from the condition in the first place. It's cause and effect, not just cause, right? So, me being chronically ill, do I go up to everybody and say, "Oh, I'm a chronically ill person"? No. I do use it as a lens when I'm trying to explain my writing process, because
Sure.
I have gone through a lot of pain. I'm not shy about describing it, and it has led to me being creative. There's a very clear
Yeah.
line there when I'm explaining myself as a writer and a person that, yes, I have struggled, I have overcome it. I'm not defined by the struggle, I'm defined by the overcoming. So, going online and saying, I have chronic depression. All right, that's not a character trait. You not showing that you have chronic depression and having it, I should not need to know, right? If you can show me a person who does not seem depressed, but you are massively depressed, good job. There's some character.
Mhm.
But instead, they're taking the baseline tags of the issue and using them to define themselves. And that goes from, any kind of neurodivergence to any kind of social cause, too. Which is why a lot of these people, you'll call them social justice warriors, which, it's a warrior in the means that they have a pen and a piece of paper and they can throw it in your face. They don't have a sword for social justice.
Right.
And so they're not a warrior, they're a town crier. And that's really it. But they claim I'm not trying to paint this globally. There are actual people who actually care about these causes, obviously. And there are people who do make great change. But the thing is the ones that I think really matter are the ones who enact change but do not boast about it constantly.
Yeah.
They're the people who, by their circumstances, understand that changes need to be made and they make them. They don't tell you they're going to make them.
Right.
Because it's not about saying we need to change this, it's about changing it, right? So, and part of this I'm sure is related to the social media age where everyone needs to spread everything about themselves, and the fact that it's really not a matter of you actually telling people online what you are. It's about you painting the best possible image of yourself and standing on the pedestal you want to live on
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the views of everyone else. But, if you actually made the changes, yeah, you'd probably be a little less socially rewarded for it. I think the social reward for actual virtue is relatively rare. But that's what makes an actual good person.
Right.
And when you pretend at it constantly, it bugs the hell out of me. It's like I use social media for advertising. I very rarely make any claims on Twitter or anything like that. I don't get in arguments because I don't see the value of it. I think the chances of me getting anyone to change their mind on social media about anything is so low that it's not worth the effort. And even if I did change a person's mind, there isn't probably going to be a lot of utility in it. I could better spend
Right.
my time raising my son, creating interesting things, and improving my own life. Because by that, I might slightly improve the lives of the people around me and the people I love, and there's some
Right.
value in that.
Sure.
But me boasting about it isn't going to do anything.
Right. No, that's very true.
It's
Very.
weird how this stuff is so interconnected.
Yeah. It is. It is. It's also to me just weird how it doesn't fit together. It doesn't add up. Uh,
No.
It's no longer about the logic. Logic has sort of been thrown out the window, and it's in some cases about feelings and preferences as opposed to, looking at in a period of time when everybody says trust the science, or where we don't use any kind of scientific method in these things. I mean, there's a reason that philosophers used logic because it was a way to get at deeper truths by
Yeah.
looking for consistencies, things that if it makes sense and you can prove it, even part of it, then you can deduce other things from that. But we don't tend to do that. In fact, I think we've gotten to a point for so many people where they're listening to whoever they happen to follow, right? Whether it's online or in their personal lives or whatever, they tend to just accept things on face value and argue them, and then you realize in some of these arguments that they don't know what they're talking about, that
Yeah.
they hold something as true, um, even though it might not be considered a matter of faith. It becomes a matter of faith.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
A lot of people's god nowadays is the social media machine.
Isn't that funny?
Everything that comes out of social media is gospel.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Yeah, and so we all always these demigods on there that are taking their shirts off and doing live.
Influencers, the demigods of the current age.
Well, shoot, if somebody's going to pay you 50 grand a month to talk online, shoot, that's not a bad
Oh, yeah.
gig if you can get it.
Well, okay, so here's sort of an interesting thought, right? In a way to try to make some sense out of the big riddle here. So, if you're online, right, and you are making a comment towards somebody, or you are projecting your opinion and your ideology on someone, I think that you can. I mean, maybe people would argue that you can't apply any kind of scientific method or math or anything to morality or to social utility, but I argue differently. But to start, it's like if you are taking something that someone else is doing personally and lambasting it, well, who are you making happy? Who are you making miserable? And is the happiness created out of misery? So if I go and yell at somebody for a choice they made, right? Maybe I feel good, but it's a happiness that I've gained through that person's misery. And that person's probably miserable because they're being talked down to. And when the mob mentality comes in, I would say that all of the happiness created through negative interaction is pretty much null.
Yeah,
And that net overall, you have decreased the amount of happiness overall. That you've essentially ruined this person's choice for them that might have had value. And what are you gaining from it? Who is somebody actually hurting by personally identifying as a different race? Okay? There are some arguments for very specific cases, right? Where, but these are based in sometimes racist systems, which we don't identify as racist, but let's say somebody like the woman identifies as black and is then able to gain a job that she would not have been able to gain if she identified as Caucasian. Was it fair that she couldn't gain that job as a Caucasian in the first place? You might argue that she's taking the job from an African American, but why was the job reserved for an African American if you say systems like that are unfair? You can drag it all the way back and it ends up being this. I know it's still just racism, but you'd say it's sort of counter racism or anti racism, where the same systems that are being complained about segregating peoples into certain camps are causing problems in the opposite direction. Like, rather than hiring an actor for their acting prowess, you hire them as a token actor for a race because you want to be inclusive.
hmm
The problem with that is your inclusivity is actually excluding a race. If
of
everybody
course.
can't be white, that means that, or if there has to be a black character, that means that character can't be white, meaning that you have to exclude white people, so you are already segregating the casting. Even though, well, you probably have more white people to pick from.
Right.
So you're actually segregating more people in order to be inclusive, where if, 1 in 4 characters was black, okay, that's in there.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into the historical problems with all this diversity because there are multiple kinds of diversity. There is separated diversity,
Well, yeah, there's
but
diversity is allowed in everything but philosophy and attitudes about politics
yeah,
because there is diversity is not allowed on college campuses. There is no intellectual diversity other than by scientific discipline. But in terms of philosophy and let's call it politics, there is no diversity allowed. It is absolutely not allowed. Professors who are conservative have been forced out, or when they retired have been replaced by folks who might identify themselves as either liberal or progressive. And I don't think anybody actually knows what those terms mean anymore because they don't mean what they used to mean. But the fact is
thank
that
you,
you're
lexicon.
but you're absolutely right right, exactly. You're absolutely right that diversity is pretty narrowly defined
Yeah,
now, and it certainly doesn't necessarily include merit, diversity of merit,
no,
right? It's just fascinating to me. We've had a little shift here. But it's fascinating to me the number of court cases that are coming down the pikes or have come down where particularly Asians or Asian Americans have been clearly discriminated against because because they tend to top the charts,
Yep.
right? So
So
if you
there's
open
like an anti quota of Asians. You can't go over
there is
this number of
it's
Asians in this university.
absolutely observable. There's no question about it, and it's been deemed by many universities to be okay.
Yeah.
They support that. Um, so it's so if you've got because and there are lots of factors. That's why I think I want to be Asian maybe in my next life because there are cultural differences in attitudes about education,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and you could and I would be deemed a racist if I started, pointing to, but let's say within different groups of varying races, colors, and creeds, there are differences in attitude about education and accomplishment,
Yeah.
right? One might, and I won't go into the specifics, but one might look at the nationalities and ethnic backgrounds of Nobel Prize winners, and you might be surprised, but I wouldn't be. There are, I'll give you the example I'm thinking of is if you look at Judaism, the Jewish community, writ large, has produced far more as a percentage of their world population, a much higher percentage of Nobel Prize winners than anybody else.
Yep.
Is it because of is there a difference in native intelligence? It might not be popular to say there might be, right? One, I wouldn't discount it one way or the other.
No, it
One,
is a
two,
possibility.
is there a difference in culture that causes children to be raised in a particular way? Oh, that's clear. Has there been a long standing tradition of questioning and reading and the kinds of things that make children excel? Absolutely, right? And one doesn't have to delve into the stereotypes to understand that there is a cultural difference that also includes at least some Asian
Well,
communities.
I think diving into the stereotypes is fitting here because you see it in movies and you hear about it where some Asian parents, and I will not paint this that broadly, but they focus very hard on their children's grades. And that's not a negative. It's not even an untrue stereotype. Yes, they do put a lot of focus, young, on grades and artistic expression. Yeah, maybe they go a little too far sometimes. Some families go a little too far making their kids play like the violin 2 hours every day. That's specific cases I know of. But
Yeah, right.
there is a truth there that
Yeah.
their focus on education has raised them up in the intellectual space and they are now being discriminated against for the effort that maybe they didn't even want to put in. As a kid, they probably didn't want to spend all that time studying, but they did. And so they should get into a good school for it. I don't think the answer here is to limit how many Asians you have. I think it's to have more good schools.
Well, part of there's one sort of corollary to this, and that is that there is some evidence that there are people that are brought in um, to very high achievement type schools that for a variety of reasons are given a pass, to get in that don't prosper there. They just are not equipped, whether it's educationally, culturally, or their basic knowledge or whatever it is, or their basic academic skill,
And so,
or
why is the discrimination okay when it's upward?
well, that's
Right?
Well, that's, it's all about oppression. That's why it's so popular to be oppressed, right? If you have to make a choice, right? Do you want to be privileged or oppressed? Well, the answer is you want to be oppressed because then you got a story to tell. Otherwise, you're most likely an oppressor, and that makes you most likely Caucasian, right?
And to
It's
therefore be ignored and maligned.
Yeah, well, by the way, I refuse to use the word cis or the phrase cis. I'm sorry,
That's
I
fine.
won't express myself that
Go
way.
for it. That's,
But I just refuse. But being a white male of European background who not by chance but by biology identifies and otherwise is male, um, I'm on the wrong side of that, and I don't feel like a victim. In fact, I feel like somebody who had parents neither of whom graduated from high school, and we're just one generation into, the my grandparents on my mother's side were immigrants. Both of them, they didn't speak English.
Yeah.
And my father's family, well, his father's side had been in the country for a long time, but the maternal side of my father's family was relatively new to the country as well, and spoke German. Um, Now, one would argue, well, that being the case, you still enjoy certain privileges because of the way you look. Okay, fine, I can't say anything about that. That is, we are where we are, and to the extent that we use victimhood to paint ourselves into a corner where we never are able to pull ourselves out of whatever predicament we're in, then that's an individual choice, I think.
Yeah, and I think there is a very important functional difference between using victimhood as some kind of excuse and using it as a challenge. Because I think that, and maybe this is just me because I would say I'm a victim of circumstance, that I was born with a lot of problems that most people won't have. And I won't go too far into them. Suffice to
Right.
say, I've been sick since I was younger than a teen.
Oh yeah,
And
for sure.
sick in a way that if it were 40 years ago, I would be dead already.
Yeah, most likely.
Probably a while ago. But I don't say, "Oh, I'm sick, I can't do that." In fact, I work very hard to make sure that I am at family events despite it.
Mhm.
And I've
Mhm.
used it to try to turn myself into a stronger person. And so the fact that I am sick does not bother me. In fact, I value it. Because I would not be me, I would not have the things that I love and that I cherish if I were not sick. And so when you take, I won't call it victimhood here, when you take a negative circumstance and you use it as a challenge to overcome, you become an infinitely stronger person from it. Advancing without any hurdles means that you are walking on a flat road. And ask anybody who works out, walking on a flat road isn't going to get you a whole lot, but climbing up a mountain, that's going to make you strong. And I don't deny anybody's personal struggles, anybody's sort of anybody being set up to fail, because a lot of people are. There are a lot of negative prejudices in the world, and there are a lot of circumstances that are outside of people's control that make life hard. But life being hard also makes it rewarding. You ask anybody who has so much money they don't know how to spend it, they're not very happy people
Right.
because there are no lows to measure the highs against. So their high might be a lot higher than yours, relatively speaking, but their normal is just below that high, just below it. So for them, there's no functional difference. And I personally vastly disagree with the whole sins of the father ideology
Right.
about race and mistreatment. I do not think
Right.
anybody is responsible for what their ancestors did. Because if we were, literally everybody on the planet Earth would be paying reparations to everybody else.
Well, in California, they're talking about $1 million, or well, somebody mentioned a million, but I think they have this group, this study group or whatever they're calling it, panel, commission, whatever it is, that put a number like 250, $280,000, and it is some gigantic bill, and I just question how the heck you decide who's going to get it. And frankly, for 200, 300,000, I might move to California and claim that that one of my great great grandparents was a slave. It might not be a bit. So we get back to how we started. I might decide that going forward, in order to put myself in a better position to collect the booty out there in Cali, that I identify as a great 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 grandson of slaves. Why not?
And
Right?
that and on the basis of the whole system being problematic, okay, that does put a little bit of unfairness on it. But at the same time, it's not necessarily untrue that even as a Caucasian, you are probably related in some way down the line to slaves of some sort. The thing
There's
is
no
that
question about it.
none of the people who are going to claim these rewards have actively been enslaved. And I know that's a
No.
problematic argument. That's not the whole of it, but the problem is that it's way too broadly thrown out. I mean, if you find a person, right, whose direct ancestor, you know, you trace it back 6 generations or whatever, you find a plantation owner who beat slaves, and you can track down the families of those slaves. Okay, I think reparation might make a little bit of sense there, a little bit, but it does not make sense to take from a whole people who are probably related more to immigrants and non-slave owners. Some of them might have been freedom fighters for the cause, and just malign them as having been, well, your skin is white. Somebody owned a slave somewhere. I don't find that fair. Just like I could say the same thing about a lot of African people and African Americans who were related, probably at some point, to Africans who initially sold the slaves to America.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's
No,
like we
absolutely.
didn't go over there and be like, hey, we're taking all your people. It's like, oh, yeah, we got these undesirables. You want them? It's like it was on offer. It, it's there are exceptions to that, but overall, a lot of them were on offer. It's and that's
Right.
not a defense of slavery. It's just a fact that people enslave their own people. People enslave other people. Slavery is kind of part of the human condition historically,
Oh,
and
it is.
forgetting that is a problem.
You know, the Romans enslaved all sorts of people. The Greeks enslaved all the Phoenicians. The slavery has a multi-thousand year. It may be more of the
It's
human
probably
condition.
older than human history.
Probably is, right. And it goes back to, this idea of tribes. If you're not in the tribe, then maybe not using these words, but you're not fully human. That you're not. If you're not a member of the tribe, then you're an outsider, and that also means your life might either be, forfeit, or that the best you could hope for is that you're enslaved by the people who conquer you. That's just the way it was.
Yeah.
The women were taken, women were raped, all that stuff. All of that is very old in human nature. It's interesting because I sometimes think, not to make this theological, but I think there's a concept in, certainly in Christianity and maybe elsewhere, about what we might call original sin. Now, most people say, well, that's the sin of Adam, right? But I really sometimes conceptualize it as more like that part of human nature, which is, I'm going to say, sinful. And I don't think many people would disagree that slavery is, we might use it, you might say wrong, you might say, it's unethical or immoral. I'd say it's sinful because that's just my language about it, right? And that's, to me, that's one of the many things. The sin of Cain and Abel was murder, right? Murdering one's brother, but murdering anybody. And so we've come from a place where this was natural to having risen to a point where we, at least at some level in culture, understand that some things are just unacceptable. And, I'm sure you could find a culture where cannibalism is acceptable,
Oh, there's
but
plenty
by
of
and
them.
large, right? But by and large, certainly in what, see, I can only speak for Western culture because that's where I live. Um, but that most of these things would be unacceptable, and slavery became unacceptable, in the early 1800s when
Yeah.
the Brits decided to put an end to it,
Yeah.
right? And there's a very juicy interview, and I wish I could quote it was Don Lemon's program actually, and it was just after Queen Elizabeth II passed away, and I think he was race baiting this woman who was not a spokesman for the royal family, but a a commentator. There are such things in Britain because there's so much interest in it. We don't do so
Yeah.
much of that, but she was a commentator and focused on the royal family and associated factors. And he said, well, there are a lot of people now that are talking about but this tremendous amount of wealth that is held by the royal family. I'm paraphrasing very broadly here. And maybe it's time, and people are talking about reparations. And she said, "Oh, that's interesting. So yeah, I could see doing that, but let's do this. Let's follow the supply chain back. Let's start there. Okay, let's start with those people who supplied the slaves. Let's talk about the warlords and the tribal leaders in Africa that were rounding up their enemies, and let us talk about the guys who were on the shores waiting for the Western ships, to sell those slaves who have already been sold once or twice, right, in Africa. Let's talk about them, shall we? Because let's go after them first, because they're the ones who started the supply chain, right?
Yeah.
And then she said, and how about the 4,000 or 4,000 plus sailors, British sailors that were killed in the effort to round up the slave and close down the slave trade that was taking place in northern Africa, the Barbary pirates and others, and even Jefferson went after the Barbary pirates, and so that's when people throw up their hands and they either say, "Well, this is just it's not a great idea," or they take it on faith that we're going to identify people who have been disadvantaged because of literal slavery. um, and I get the argument that there are parts of our population that, because of the roots of slavery, right, that have in some sense persisted, the causes are complicated, that still have not been able to participate in
Uh,
American culture, American society fully. I mean,
well,
I think we just have to look around. I mean, I live in the inner city, as you know,
yeah.
because you lived here, and we live in the midst of what can be sort of a problematic
No,
neighborhood.
this is.
And
I do. I want to take this in a weird direction just for a second,
yeah, go ahead.
which is,
The whole point of this conversation.
yeah. Well, you take sort of the human condition, right, and you take it. You can take it right to Darwinism, that the strong. And I'm gonna reword it slightly, but rather than survive nowadays, it's that the strong thrive and the weak subsist, right? And slavery is along that idea. You take the strong people, they round up the weak people, and they force them to do things that the strong people don't want to do. I mean, that's a lot of things nowadays. They're just less physical. Now there's social aspects, there are monetary aspects, intellectual aspects that make this control now. Rather than you being physically stronger than somebody, well, you might have been slightly better placed, and you might have been able to use your situation to your advantage. And then you could dive that right into capitalism and say that, now this is a very loose connection that I fundamentally sort of disagree with, but you could, I think, in an intellectual discussion, make the argument that capitalism is slavery light. That the very, very wealthy at the top are are using the poor as a source of labor, because that's how society works, is that there are people at the top and there are people at the bottom, but it's about the condition of them, right? That's why we wouldn't call it slavery, because the people at the bottom are not being whipped and they are not being heavily mistreated on a personal level. But I think a lot of the argues of racism are making that connection, right? That society has been, misdesigned so that the people at the top are the plantation owners, and they don't want to be at the bottom. But the thing is that, and you can see this in slavery, if you take a slave and you offer them slaves, a lot of them accepted it. And nobody really talks about that, but there are plenty of cases of freed slaves who bought plantations.
Yeah, interesting, right?
And
Well,
it's that when power is offered, corrupting or not, you're probably going to take it. That's part of being
I look
human.
at it, if here's part of the problem we have, and I think, and this could be misunderstood, but so be it, is that when we look back, uh, in history, we're in possession of knowledge and also have attitudes which are formed by our circumstances and our culture, and we take those and we look back at a society where slavery was acceptable. People have made this critique of the Bible, right? The Bible is full of slavery. There's lots of it. Was it wrong? Well, not in those days. The Romans didn't consider it wrong, right? And you can read in the Old and New Testament conversations that are being had, and writings about people who were enslaved, right? And there was a different view of it in those days, and I'm not saying it was right. Believe me, um, that's why I say this can be misunderstood. But when viewed from inside, and this is my reaction to what you said, if you were a slave owner in a society where owning slaves was allowable, maybe not right, but allowable, you might in fact choose just to be on the other side of the. You've now been offered a chance to be on the other side of the power, what I want to call it,
Dynamic.
power divide, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, it makes sense, but it has to be viewed from the context of the time
Yeah,
and the
it's
place.
relative.
It is, and we read back into history with our own view and say, how could they possibly do that?
Right.
Right? Well, they how
At
could the
that
Romans?
point,
Yeah, I mean, how could the Egyptians enslaved tens of thousands of people? The Egyptians enslaved the entire Jewish population, all of them,
to build
right?
big pointy rocks.
For 400 years, right? And they used them as labor, and the Nazis did the same thing,
Yeah.
right? With a different goal, but labor camps. It's all the same thing, one way or the other.
Yeah. It's power being used on the less powerful, which
That's
is
what it is.
it's
And
the way
today,
this all functions.
and today now we use economic power that way, and
Yep.
we've got very
And
few
social
people.
power.
That's certainly, and political power,
Yeah.
and the power of the gun. Basically, it's the coercive power of the state. I guess would be what
Yeah.
one might call it, the coercive power of the state, which is the only reason they can collect taxes. Because even people who say we should pay more, when you say you go first, they won't do it.
Oh no. If you had the option to pay or not pay taxes, everyone's gonna say no.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Maybe a thousandth of 1% of people would be like for the greater good, but
well, I think
now,
people would be more agreeable to local taxes because they
oh
can
yeah,
see, oh,
they
you
can
got
see
to
the
have
effect.
roads and stuff like that. That stuff is more agreeable. But shipping money to the federal government or any national government, and to see them waste it,
There's no
uh,
knowable and visible result that is tangible,
and when you know
and
that
that
there are people suckling at the teat of the government and are making a ton of money
yeah,
simply by being there to collect it. Much that could be said for Ukraine and other places. I mean, Afghanistan was probably the best example of a country or six, us particularly, pumping hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, and that was ending up in the pockets of the tribal warlords. Right?
yeah,
It's just because they were being bribed to be good, right?
yeah.
Until we left.
Well, we've run a bunch over today,
Okay, well,
but
that's cool.
I do
That's,
just wanna say before we call it for the night
yeah.
that all of this was said and discussed as a means of intellectual conversation and understanding. Everything we said probably, I would say most of it probably doesn't represent our direct viewpoints or our opinions, in that we are just discussing it for sake of understanding and education on a personal level. So I hope that no one was insulted. I apologize if you were insulted. This was just a discussion because discussions are meaningful. And I don't want anything to be misinterpreted or misunderstood because it's inflammatory. But I think it's important to have these discussions and to speak our minds a little bit and to be willing to change our minds. So if you
Absolutely
disagree
agree.
with something, feel free to post a comment. I will read
Yeah,
them. But
absolutely.
I just wanted to air out the laundry here and get some words on the table so that the discussion can happen, because when we're too quiet, it's boring.
Well, it's unfortunately what's happened is you get, not to belabor this, you get
No.
80% of the population just given up, and the other 20%, 10 on each side of what any issue, are just yelling at each other and nothing is happening.
Yeah.
There's no there's no legitimate, I don't think, I shouldn't say no, legitimate conversation is much harder to have today
Yeah.
than I can remember my entire life. And
There's
I hope
very
this
little
is
discourse.
this is greeted with that in mind, because we don't want to pull our punches, but we also want to try to be fair to the issues to the extent that we can. And we don't know neither of us are experts in a lot of these things, but this is what we see and hear, and try to be logical. And when we find something that doesn't look logical, we try to point it out. In
Yeah.
a lot of these situations, you get to a sort of the soft underbelly of the argument. You find out that it just doesn't make sense, at least not to us.
Yeah.
So anyway,
And
it's been a pleasure as always.
yeah. So I hope you all have a good day or night, and God bless. But just keep thinking and keep talking. We'll see.